It's 1:38 a.m. Time for Octoberpod. Good morning. This is your host, Edward October. Many of the greatest stories which are ours to tell are fairy stories. The most well-known fairy tales have become somewhat sanitized after centuries of retelling. But the best fairy stories serve as warnings. Don't take gifts from strangers. Don't wander into the woods alone. The best fairy stories serve as stark reminders for why we fear the dark. Indeed, darkness, at least the darkness which lurks within men's souls, is at the very heart of this morning's entertainment. What follows is a fairy story, but it's not for little ones or for the faint of heart. If there are small children in the room, please switch off your streaming device now as we speak again the immortal tale of Hop Frog and Trippetta. Octoberpod Recording presents Hop Frog and Trippetta. You can follow along in the book. When you hear this sound, it's time to turn the page. Let's begin. Long ago, there was a kingdom which few can now remember. The ruler of this realm was a king who enjoyed a joke more than anyone. The king and his ministers were all accomplished jokers, and they were all large, oily men. The king didn't care for witty jokes so much. No, the king's tastes were better suited to practical jokes. In those days, professional jesters were quite fashionable at court. Several of these fools wore motley with caps and bells and were expected to always be ready with sharp wit. And they, of course, were rewarded with the crumbs that fell from the royal table. The king's fool was a strange little dwarf named Hop Frog. Dwarves were common at court in those days, and the royalty loved to laugh at them. Of course, Hop Frog was not his real name. It was a nickname he earned because he walked with a limp that resembled a sort of hop and wriggle that amused the king and his court to no end. But in spite of Hop Frog's twisted legs, he had incredibly strong arms, which enabled him to climb and caper about like a squirrel or a small monkey. No one knows what country Hop Frog came from. I'm sure it was some savage region that no one has ever heard of. Hop Frog and a young girl named Trippetta, who was not quite so small as himself, had been stolen away from their homes by a courageous general and delivered as presents to the king. Naturally, Hop Frog and Trippetta became close friends. Hop Frog was always the butt of a joke, but Trippetta, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted upon due to her grace and beauty. This gave her some measure of influence, which she always used to Hop Frog's benefit. On some grand occasion, I forget what, the king threw a masquerade, which required the talents of both Hop Frog and Trippetta. Hop Frog was great at making masked balls even more fun. Finally, the night of the masquerade arrived. Trippetta was in charge of decorating the great hall. The king's ministers and other honored guests waited until the last minute to decide upon their characters and costumes. And so, Hop Frog and Trippetta were employed to help costume them all. The king summoned the two little friends to his table, where he sat with 7 members of his council, "Come, Hop Frog," cried the king. "Help us be merry. We're bored of the same old jests. We want characters. Characters, man, something novel. Come and have some wine. It will brighten your wit. Drink to absent friends." It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink to his absent friends brought tears to his eyes as he took the cup from the hand of the tyrant. "Ha!" roared the king. "See what a good wine can do. Your eyes are shining already." Poor, sad Hop Frog. His eyes moist with tears, he placed the cup nervously on the table and looked about the room with a funny, crazed look on his face. "I've just thought of a novel jest," said the dwarf, in a bit of a daze. "Excellent," roared the king. "But first have some more wine." And he poured another goblet to the dwarf, who merely stared at it with dread, for it was well known that Hop Frog disliked drinking. "Drink, I say," shouted the monster, "or by the fiends—" The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat, and, falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments in evident wonder at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss what to do or say, how most becomingly to express his indignation. At last he pushed her violently from him and threw the wine in her face. The poor girl got up the best she could, and, not daring even to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was a dead silence for about half a minute, during which the falling of a leaf or of a feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh, grating sound, which seemed to come at once from every corner of the room. "What are you making that noise for?" demanded the king, turning furiously to Hop Frog. And now the dwarf laughed. The king was too confirmed a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful teeth. And now he began to swallow as much wine as desired. "Just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face," said Hop Frog, "I remembered a frolic from my native land, often enacted among us at our masquerades, but here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires 8 persons." "Here we are," cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence. "What is the jest?" "We call it," replied the dwarf, "the 8 chained orang-utans, and it really is excellent sport, if well enacted." "We will enact it," remarked the king, drawing himself up. "The beauty of the game," continued Hop Frog, "lies in the way it frightens the ladies." "Capital!" roared in chorus the monarch and his ministry. "I will dress you as orang-utans," said Hop Frog. "The resemblance shall be so striking that the masqueraders will take you for real beasts, and of course they will be as much terrified as astonished." "Oh, this is exquisite!" exclaimed the king. "Hop Frog, I will make a man of you yet." "The chains will jangle and cause confusion. You are supposed to have escaped from your keepers. Just imagine 8 chained orang-utans. Imagine to be real ones, rushing about with savage cries among civilized ladies and gentlemen. Hopfrog disguised the men as orang-utans, using a simple method. In those days, few people in this kingdom had ever seen a real orangutan, and such people were easy to fool. The king and his ministers were wrapped in tight-fitting shirts and breeches, and then soaked with tar. Hopfrog then applied a thick coating of flax to represent the hair. Then the dwarf took a long chain and wrapped it around the waist of the king, and tied, and then passed around to the ministers next to him, and so on. Then Hopfrog seized the remaining chain and led the orang-utans as if on a leash. The masquerade was held in the circular grand salon. At night, this lofty room was illuminated by a large chandelier hanging from a chain and counterbalance system that passed outside the cupola and over the roof. Trippetta had overseen the arrangements of the room. She had the chandelier removed. The room was instead lit by sconces and some 50 or 60 other free-standing braziers and candelabrum. According to Hopfrog's instructions, the orang-utans waited until midnight, when the room would be full of masqueraders, before making their appearance. When the clock struck 12, they rushed in all together. Many of them tripped over the chains and stumbled or fell. Many of the guests supposed them to be beasts of some kind. Many of the ladies swooned with fear. A general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them locked, and the keys had been given to Hopfrog. The chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung slowly descended until the hook at one end hovered 3 feet above the door. The king and his 7 friends were soon in contact with the chandelier chain. While assisting with the jest, Hopfrog crept among them unnoticed, and hooked their chain to the one which hung from the ceiling. The masqueraders, now convinced they had been deceived, began to laugh. "Leave them to me," now screamed Hopfrog. "I think I know them. If I can only get a good look at them, I can soon tell who they are." He scrambled over the heads of the crowd and seized a torch. He returned, leaping and capering, and examined them in the light of the guttering flame. "I shall soon find out who they are." And now the room was filled with laughter, and the jester uttered a shrill whistle. Now the chandelier chain flew up 30 feet, dragging with it the struggling suspended in the skylight and the floor. Hopfrog, clinging to the chain as it rose, thrust his torch down toward them. The silence, which had settled upon the masquerade when the chain ascended, was broken by the low, harsh, grating sound that the king had heard after throwing wine in the face of Trippetta. But now it was obvious that it was the sound of the dwarf grating and gnashing his teeth. Hopfrog held the torch to the king's flaxen disguise, which then burst into a vivid flame. In an instant, all 8 were blazing amid the shrieks of the masqueraders below, who were helpless to offer them aid. At length, the flames forced the jester to climb higher up the chain. "I now see distinctly," cried the jester. What manner of people these are! They are a great king and his 7 counselors. A king who does not hesitate to strike a defenseless girl, and his 7 counselors who are complicit in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hop Frog, the jester, and this is my last jest. The 8 charred corpses swung in their chains, fetid, blackened, hideous, an indistinguishable mass of putrescence. Hop Frog hurled his torch at them and climbed to the ceiling, then disappeared through the skylight. And so, Hop Frog and Trippetta fled to their own country, and they lived happily ever after.